Hello, friends, and welcome to the grand finale of How the Gospels Became History. You've reached the end, and I thank you for journeying with me this far. This is the culmination of many chapters of work, and in this chapter, I talk about the philosophical implications of what I mean by mythic historiography and how myth connects or does not connect with truth, and specifically how historicity connects or does not connect with truth. So, without further ado, this is the conclusion called the myth of historicity. Historicity is a mode of rationality that focuses on attempting to discern and to isolate things that happened in the past. Now, this is a culturally specific value. There's not a lot of value on historicity in, say, the Aboriginal cultures of Native Australia or the Native American cultures in North America. Historicity is something that people of European culture and heritage tend to favor. And that's where history departments began. People in the West, or wherever Western culture has spread its influence, have cared about historicity. We have books contrasting myth with what really happened. We have movies that are said to be based on a true story or based on real events. And we have channels like the History Channels and a plethora of documentaries telling us what happened in the past and why it's significant today. And I, as a historian myself, am not in any way demeaning the discipline of historical work. No, I want to redirect what we get as a product from doing that historical work and to tame the claims of historians who, some of them religious historians and apologists, who claim that because Christianity is a religion that is based on events that happened in the past, therefore it is true. And also, we can undermine the opposite, that because Christianity is based on things that didn't happen in the past, therefore it is not true. In my opinion, both positions are based on false presuppositions about the connection of historicity and truth. Perhaps the first point to note is that no one is above myth. I'm not above myth. You're not above myth. Your history teacher is not above myth. The Bible is not above myth. And God is not above myth. In fact, if you believe in God, you have to believe that one of the primary ways God likes to communicate with people is through myth. The Bible isn't a history book. It never says it's a history book. It doesn't even read like a history book, at least in terms of modern canons of history. The gospel writers, as I've argued, wanted to be believed, and therefore they put their stories in historiographical form. But if you put your story in a historiographical form, that doesn't mean that it describes things that happened in the past. And it also doesn't mean that things that happened in the past must be true. So the important thing to note here is that we all have myths. We can't get rid of myths. If we get rid of myths, we get rid of our identity. America has a myth about being the greatest nation on earth, a city on a hill, a defender of public liberty and democracy across the globe. There's nothing necessary about that. And really prior to the end of World War II, that was not the presupposition of what America was supposed to do. Myths develop over time, and myths are always changing. Myths are what we believe, they're what we believe about ourselves. They are what we believe about society, they are what we believe about the universe. Now, we'd like to think that what we believe about ourselves and the universe and society is based on science. And some of it is. I mean, increasingly, it can be based on things we refer to as scientific facts. But a lot of it still isn't. And we just have to come face to face with the fact that our stories that we tell, they aren't necessary. And they aren't necessarily true in any kind of universal sense. And that if we have the courage to go visit another culture, to spend a year in China or spend a year in North Korea, we're going to learn very different sorts of myths. And we're going to learn very different sorts of things about what makes a human human, and what makes a human good, and what makes a nation good. And we're going to realize that our fundamental beliefs aren't necessary. The stories that we hold sacred are sacred because they've been inculcated into us. And we might defend them until death, and that is perfectly acceptable. And maybe we should do that. But what we're defending is not their universal truth, but their value to us. No one is above myth. Now, the myth of historicity is that historicity gives us access to truth. The big reveal here is that it doesn't. No history book gives you access to truth. History is just a story, supposedly about events that happened in the past. And even if we had a time machine and went back to the past and saw what really happened, well, we would still have to see it and perceive it, and then we'd tell a story about it. And that story is colored by our perception and our imagination. And this is very much true of the Gospels. It's true of any story, but it's very much true of the Gospels that these are products of their religious imagination. They are aiming to convince people that they tell events that really happened. But whether those events happened or not doesn't actually have any bearing on whether the things related are true. I mean, let's face it, whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, or whether or not he was born of a virgin, actually don't prove or disprove that he is a God and worthy of worship. A lot of things in life are exactly this way, that we believe things, we believe truths, we have access to spiritual truths, and some things we know better than we know ourselves, and we don't know why we know them. Resurrection is a myth. It's something that you believe or you don't believe. It's a story about the revivification of life. And whether or not Jesus was raised has no bearing on whether resurrection is true. And this is a hard saying, I know, for many people, but it's the medicine for apologists. Historicity is our cultural value, and has no bearing on truth. People with no love or knowledge or even care for historicity can still have as much access to truth as anybody else. So, this is the weird paradox, or I should say, the paradox that sounds weird because we've all been conditioned to believe that what happened in the past is what's real. But as a philosophical position, that may or may not be defensible. And I don't really think that it is defensible philosophically. The first problem is that history doesn't really give you access to what happened in the past. History is just a story about the past. and it may or may not be wrong. But what is guaranteed is that it's colored by the human imagination and perception, and it changes over time. As more and more people tell and retell the story, it changes and shapeshifts throughout time. And that's okay. There's nothing we can do about that. What historians do is they try to go back and they try to reconstruct what really happened based on the multiple stories that have come into existence over time. That's a worthwhile task. That's an important task. That's a very important task. But a historian is no closer to the truth than anybody else. Religions aren't based on what happened in the past. Religions are based on the felt truth, the truth that people feel in their heart and mind and souls, right here in the present. If we want to convince ourselves that Christianity is true because it corresponds to things that happened in the past, well, you can try that, but in the end, it will be like leaning on a broken staff, a broken cane. You can never prove what happened in the past. Historians can never prove what happened in the past. All we have are hypotheses. And even if we could prove what happened in the past, it wouldn't prove that that was true. And it wouldn't prove that our religion is true. So let's just call a spade a spade. Historicity does not give us access to truth. Another way of saying this is that stories point to past events, but they cannot tell us what is true. Now, I should refine this a little bit because most stories really aren't about what happened in the past. Most stories are just stories. They're told for enjoyment, they're told for comfort, they're told for the purposes of creating truth within us and resonating with our inner light, so to speak. Historical stories do try to tell us about past events, but they can't absolutely give us access to the past. They aren't time machines. They're just things that people tell in the present about the past. The past is gone. The past is dead because it's past. Time moves ever forward. And if we can't discover the truth in the present, then there's no hope of discovering it in the past or in the future. So think carefully about how the Gospels were produced. I know that some people don't think that Jesus exists or existed, but whether or not he existed is actually a little bit irrelevant. What we have is the story, and the story itself, apart from what happened, can convey religious truth. If you think about the gospel writers, they're not writing in the immediate aftermath of the events. They're writing a generation after the supposed events occurred, sometimes two generations, possibly three. They have had a great deal of time to think about the story of Jesus. And it's this thinking, this processing, this human processing of reception is what makes the stories change and metamorphose over time. And they become more relevant to people. I think the Gospel of John is a great instance of this, that it seems at once closer and farther from history. Jesus basically stands above history, sort of has one foot in and out of history in John. He's got these long, long monologues, which are fictionalized inventions, but they speak such profound truth that the book itself has a sort of magic to it. I think what's really important to understand is that the process of how the early Christians were imagining Jesus is very similar to the process that people thinking about Jesus today might process those events. Resurrection may or may not have happened in the past, and frankly, it's irrelevant. The only real resurrection that's important is the resurrection in the stories that we tell today. And that is important because if we're convinced that resurrection is real, after reflecting on the story of Jesus, then it is real. And we don't need the past event to confirm that. Resurrection, if it happens anywhere, happens in the heart and in the mind. Now, we may be inspired after thinking and realizing the truth of resurrection to write an account of resurrection and even to present it as something that happened in the past. All that's well and good, but it doesn't change the reality. We came upon resurrection because we thought about it, because we processed it, because we read the story over and over again and we realized the truth of it. To my mind, resurrection has more to do with the rebirth of a flower in spring than it has to do with a man who lived in Palestine 2,000 years ago. But the story of that flower and the story of that man in Palestine can tell of the same truth, the same spiritual truth, if you will. Whether or not you believe it, whether or not you can believe it, that's up to you. My point in this book is that the gospel writers want you to believe the truth of their narratives, and therefore they presented them as historical. Whether they are historical is up for grabs. Whether they point to real past events is undiscernible. But what is more discernible is that even if they did point to past events, that's irrelevant to the religious truth or non truth of what is being said. We've got to find that truth in ourselves, or we will find it nowhere. Thus ends our series. And I want to end on a joyful note and hope that this has produced at least food for thought for you. I apologize for this low-tech presentation. All the audio issues in this series show you that I'm definitely not an expert at making videos. But I hope through all of this you have seen my passion for getting out this material to you. I think it's important, and my sincere hope is that you've benefited, and that if you've benefited, you'll consider purchasing the book and perhaps joining me on Patreon where we can talk further about these issues. Thank you again to all who have watched and learned, and I hope to learn many more things with you.